Hi everyone, I'm Jan Wegener and welcome back to my early bird photo news. There's some new exciting information coming out about the upcoming Canon R1 and R5 Mark II, so we're going to have to talk about that. And in particular, the newly leaked information about the R5 Mark II really makes me wonder what this camera will actually be like. And on top of that, I'm also going to share some new information about the R5 Mark II that I haven't seen posted anywhere else. I almost released a second news video last week right after my episode of the Early Bird Photo News where I shared some new information about the R5 Mark II because it seemed like a major US retailer had accidentally leaked all the specifications for the upcoming R1, and that's obviously big news. And the specs actually sounded pretty amazing, up to 120 frames per second, super fast autofocus, and the fastest stack sensor ever built, faster than a mechanical shutter. So definitely a camera I would love to have in my hands. But then I thought, haven't I read these specs one-to-one somewhere else? And it turned out these specs were just a one-to-one copy of a rumor that had been circulating around since like February or so. So it seemed like someone at the camera shop simply copied over the old rumor and pasted it onto the R1 sales page, trying to create a little bit more buzz. So in the end, I think this was all a big nothing burger, and the camera shop since then has also released a statement saying this was a big mistake, this is not the real specs. Now this could still turn out to be the right specs, but I'd say it's highly unlikely that a rumor in February would know all the specs of the R1 this far out from the announcement date. So while those juicy specs probably turn out to be nothing, there has been another interesting development when it comes to the R1 because we've seen some photos posted of it being used in the field at the Formula 1 Grand Prix in Monaco. So it seems like one of the photographers there got bored of photographing cars and actually discovered someone else using an R1 in the field and managed to take some close-up pictures of it. Looking at these pictures, it looks like the R1 is going to be a mix of a 1DX Mark III and an R3, taking design features from both bodies and incorporating into one new body. There seem to be a few buttons in particular that we can't find like that on the R3. It's a shame that we can't see the back of the camera and the flip out screen and the button layout there because that would be a lot more revealing, but for now I think it's another nice little sneak peek into what the camera will be like, and so far I must say I'm definitely intrigued by it, especially if it has more than the 30 megapixels, but even at the 30 megapixels with that nice body and maybe shooting up to 120 frames per second, it's definitely an exciting camera. Speaking about 120 frames per second, I also owe you one more Sony video that I'm currently working on, but the last weeks you may have noticed that I haven't been posting as many videos because I've been swept up in a few other big projects I'm working on, like a new website for instance, and that's going to take up a lot of my time, but I'm definitely going to post one more video about the Sony A9 Mark III and the R1 in combination with the new 2.8 300mm lens and the teleconverters in the field. Why don't we talk a little bit more about the R5 Mark II now? Last week I shared some new information that was sent to me and I'm fairly confident that this was accurate. And Canon Rumors seems to have confirmed some of the things that I've said as well. So we can be quite confident that we're going to get a camera with 45 megapixels, a very fast stack sensor, probably around 30% faster than the R3, some sort of pre-burst feature, hopefully better incorporated than in the R6 Mark II, and then we get a mechanical shutter with 12 frames per second and an electronic shutter with up to 30 frames per second. And from what I've heard, we should also be able to select different frame rates in the electronic shutter mode, which would be great rather than on the current R5 where we can only shoot at 20 frames per second. On top of that, we will also get some design features taken over from the R6 Mark II, in particular probably the on-off video switch, and there will also be a new cooling solution in the camera, probably some sort of opening at the bottom of it to help with the overheating, especially in video mode. And then we also seem to be getting the eye control autofocus in the camera. So that's all the information we know so far, but I also have some new information I'm fairly confident in, and that is that the camera will have one SD card slot and one CF Express Type B card slot. So now a lot of people, including me, were hoping to get two CF Express Type B card slots, but it seems like Canon, in this segment at least, will stick with the one SD card slot and one CF Express card slot, which is not really a surprise because the Nikon Z8 has the same, for instance, but personally, at least, I really hope that at some stage at least we can get rid of these slow SD cards and focus on the much faster cards. By far the strangest part for me about all these specs is the inclusion of a mechanical shutter with 12 frames per second. And the big question is, why does the R5 Mark II need a mechanical shutter? If we have a super fast stacked sensor with a readout speed 30% faster than the R3, that should kind of eliminate all rolling shutter issues from the camera. So if the rolling shutter is not really an issue anymore, hopefully at least, what are the reasons that Canon would still include a mechanical shutter in the R5 Mark II? Because the Nikon Z8, Z9 or the Sony A9 Mark III, for instance, don't have a mechanical shutter at all anymore and the cameras work perfectly fine. So the only reason I can think of that the R5 Mark II needs a mechanical shutter is that there's some limitations with the electronic shutter that Canon can only address with the inclusion of a mechanical shutter. The main ones being either not being able to shoot flash with the electronic shutter, but that would be strange because the R3, for instance, can do that. So I assume the R5 Mark II would also be able to do that. So the only other reason I could think of at the moment at least is that they might not give us 14-bit RAW files across the board with the electronic shutter at all frame rates. And that would definitely be a big disappointment because in the current R5, for instance, we have 14-bit RAW files with the mechanical shutter, but only 12-bit RAW files with the electronic shutter. So I don't know if the R5 Mark II will actually shoot 14-bit RAW files or maybe only 12-bit RAW files at the 30 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode. But if it wasn't 14-bit RAW files, I would definitely be a little bit disappointed because that definitely shows up in your image quality. Do you guys have any other ideas why the R5 Mark II might still come with a mechanical shutter? Looking at the competition, it seems like unless there's some major limitation with it, there's no need to include the mechanical shutter, is there? Looking at the leaked specifications for the R1 and the R5 Mark II, it also seems to become more clear how Canon is going to differentiate the two cameras. The R1 will likely going to have less megapixels, but will be the much faster camera with much higher frame rate. So much faster stack sensor, but it's also likely going to shoot at 60 if not 120 frames per second, whereas the R5 Mark II is probably going to tap out at the 30 frames per second. On top of that, I'm also hoping that the R1 will be shooting 14-bit RAW files across the board and will also have two CIF Express Type B card slots rather than the inclusion of the SD card like we have in the R3, for instance. On top of that, I'm also fairly certain that the R1 will have a more advanced autofocusing system compared to the R5 Mark II. Now we will have to decide whether those extra specifications are going to be worth an extra $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for us, but at the same time I must say the R1 definitely sounds intriguing to me, and so does the R5 Mark II, of course. One thing I haven't heard anything about is the potentially battery grip that will be coming for the R5 Mark II that should hopefully then also work on the Canon R6 Mark II because the current battery grip has been discontinued. So I assume at least that we're going to be seeing a new battery grip coming out with the R5 Mark II as well. And I really hope that it's better with better positioning of the buttons than the current grip on the R5. When it comes to more announcements of the cameras, I can't really say anything, but I'd keep my eye out for early June for something to come out. Whether it's a lens or camera, I'm not entirely sure, but potentially early June we'll have another announcement, and it seems like Canon likes to announce things on a Wednesday. If you're a Lightroom user, this is also an exciting week for you because you have been given some new exciting features by Adobe, in particular the generative remove. It's a bit different to the generative fill in Photoshop, but it helps you to remove anything you want from your images in Lightroom. The only downside is that if you work in an area larger than 1024 by 1024 pixels, that the result will then not look quite accurate compared to the rest of your image because it will be smoother and not have as many detail and no noise in it. So if you use the tool just in a small size, it will work perfectly for you. And in a larger size, there's no great solution available at the moment in Lightroom. In Photoshop, we already have an enhanced detail option, and I can only assume eventually that will trickle down into Lightroom as well. But for now, it seems like the tool is best used when just using it in a box smaller than 1024 by 1024 pixels. So if you haven't tried it yet, I'd say update your Lightroom and play around with the tool because it's pretty amazing what it can remove from your images. Speaking about image editing, if you want to get great results when it comes to image editing and become more confident, I would highly recommend that you check out my PROSETS, my masterclass, and my brush pack. With my PROSETS, I allow you with just one click to transform your RAW files, and in my masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop to get fantastic results from your own RAW files. And with my brush pack, I help you to make all these adjustments in Photoshop that little bit easier. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check this out down there in the description. When it comes to camera news overall, this seems to be a rather quiet month. We have the R1 and the R5 Mark II that's really exciting, but Sony and Nikon in particular have remained pretty quiet. And I know a lot of Nikon users at least are still waiting for Z6 Mark III, but it seems like we're not really going to hear anything about that camera at least until sometime in June, if not later than that. Nikon did have a great milestone though, with 120 million Nikon lenses being produced. That's a pretty mind-blowing number, isn't it? Speaking about lenses, it seems like Canon definitely has a big production issue when it comes to the 200 to 800mm lens, because a lot of people have ordered a lens last year in November and they're still waiting for it. And I've spoken to some retailers that have said they have 18 orders, 50 orders, but I've only received like 2 or 3 lenses and haven't received any lenses in the last few months. So definitely something going on with that lens. And I can only hope that sooner rather than later it becomes more readily available, because it's definitely a great lens to use in the field. Are you one of the people that ordered the lens ages ago but still waiting on it? And on that rather disappointing note, I think it's time to wrap up this week's Early Bird Photo News. If you have any ideas for topics I should be making, questions for me, or thoughts about this video, make sure to let me know in the comments. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, check out my channel membership, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye guys!